Hello YouTube. I'll tell you about the UFOs over Kuril Islands. A very interesting phenomenon. I'm sure we'll know more as the Russian military expands in the area and there's more attention from the Japanese. Virtually unknown area to Western and I'm sure Oriental researchers too. But we definitely need to keep an eye on it because I found fascinating cases of UFOs and USOs from the area of the Kuril Islands. The islands themselves are very unique and, as I told before, contain a number of secrets and mysteries. And I'm sure we'll get to all of them. So let me begin and tell you about the islands and the UFO encounters through the years. The Kuril Islands represent a chain of 56 large and small islands between the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula and the Japanese Hokkaido Island. It's a convex arc that separates the Sea of Okhotsk from the Pacific Ocean. Total length of the islands is about 1,200 kilometers. Total area is about 10,500 square kilometers. The islands form two parallel ridges, large Kuril and small Kuril. Not one of the islands looks like any other islands in the Kuril Island chain. Altogether, it's a wonderful creation of nature. There are 19,000 Russians who reside on the remote rocky islands. I've talked to people from the islands and those who visited them, and they recall certain magnetism. People do get attracted and tend to stay on the islands. In itself, it's not easy to leave them because the transportation system is not at all developed, and sometimes it takes weeks to leave the islands. But they are beautiful and quite unusual, and one can always find something interesting there. Japanese tourists have certain limits about coming to the island, and I'll try to discuss it in the future. But UFOs have no limits, have no transportation issues, and have been known to come to the islands for, I would say, hundreds of years, but probably longer than that. The most important islands and the most known islands, the southern islands of the archipelago, are Iturup, Kunashir, and Shikotan. A Russian map shows that they're part of the Sakhalin region. Japan considers them to be part of the Hokkaido prefecture. And we know that they're part of the so-called extreme north. Iturup, Kunashir, and Shikotan are the easiest islands to get to in the Kuril Island chain. For 46 years, there was no access to the islands for the Japanese citizens. In 1992, first Japanese started arriving there within the framework of the visa-free exchange between the population of South Kuril Islands and the Japanese. What's interesting is that back in 1960s, on the island of Kunashir, one could find a number of Shintoist temples, and Soviet sailors lived in the old Japanese towns, Japanese-built towns and houses. And sometimes you could find Japanese wooden roads. But everything was destroyed as the years went by because the Soviet government basically erased any remnants of the Japanese presence on the island. The only recognized monuments, let's say, historical monuments, were the Ainu cultural objects. The Ainu were the aboriginal people of the islands who resided there before the Russians and the Japanese, and who suffered from both. As for the Japanese presence or art or anything like that, it's all been gone. However, there's enough for professional archaeologists to look for in the islands. There are enough discoveries to be made, and some of them do find quite interesting things. but we're not concerned about archaeology today. We want to talk about UFOs. And one of the most interesting cases are the cases of the so-called disappearing airplanes. The first one took place in 1953 on the island of Kunashir. That's not far from the Japanese island of Hokkaido. This story was told to a well-known Russian UFO researcher in Yaroslavl, Yuri Smirnov. I knew him and exchanged a lot of information many years ago and published some of my most interesting articles about Western ufology and collected information about Russian cases too. His name was Yuri Smirnov, and he was told by somebody who lived in Yaroslavl at the time, Lyudmila Shevchenko, who was in 1953 military doctor at the island in the Kurils. And she recalled a case when a Soviet jet plane basically disappeared in view of the observers on the island. It was trying to land, and when it almost reached the landing strip, and while being over the ocean, the airplane started vanishing right before their eyes and then disappeared like it never existed. And when it vanished, any radio communications with the airplane disappeared as well. Later, Soviet divers searched the area, but they never were able to locate anything, and there was no basically conclusion to the investigation which was undertaken. 1953 was a crazy year in Soviet UFO research. I mentioned a few cases in my other presentation, and we'll speak more about it. But 13 years go by, and another unusual year for UFO research, 1966, comes about. And what do you know? There was another case of a vanishing airplane over the same territory, and it was told by Ivan Alexandrovich Sharin, who was a lieutenant colonel in retired. He wrote a very interesting book about death of Soviet cosmonaut Gagarin, published not that long ago. Sharin used to know a lot of people in the industry, so to say. He knew cosmonauts, he knew top pilots and engineers, and he had done his own research also in this history of Soviet aviation and space exploration. He was a well-known pilot who served 21 years and flew on MiG-15 over 755 times. So he knew what he was talking about, and he was able to collect documents which were considered to be secret for a long time. He himself had encountered UFOs or strange phenomena a number of times. Once in 1971 at night over the Ural Perm city. His airplane was, he recalled that his airplane basically was, what should I say, a net was placed on his airplane, very thick net, glowing net was placed on his airplane in flight, and he was partially paralyzed. When he released the landing wheels was when the net actually disappeared. It was a very unusual case, very interesting. I've never heard about any similar cases in the Soviet UFO history. The other time, he and the traffic controller noticed gigantic UFO over the secret base for Soviet strategic rockets near Perm. The third time, he observed egg-shaped UFO when he was flying back from Afghanistan. Sharin couldn't mention this case to his superiors because he didn't want to be fired, as happened to other more brave pilots, in terms that they were brave enough to go and talk about UFOs, and because of their actions, they were taken out and never flew again. The situation changed in 1981, and I already mentioned the Setka program and the instructions given to the Soviet service people to report any unusual anomalous phenomenon. And the information was sent to the two research centers, one in Moscow, one in Leningrad. But we need to get back to the Kuril Islands. According to Sharin, there was another case of a disappearing airplane. In 1966, it was MiG-17, and it was chasing an airplane that crossed the Soviet borders, and it disappeared in view of everybody else. Basically nothing was found, no fragments, nothing like that, not even the oil stains on the surface of the water. Actually, the Soviet submarines and military divers were looking for that airplane that disappeared in 1966. In 1989, another memorable year in the history of Soviet ufology, on the island of Shikotan, a number of people observed very unusual afterglow. At first, they thought that the volcano Ivan the Terrible on the island of Iturup started acting up, but then they found out later that this is not so. What was observed by Soviet border guards was a strange elliptical shaped cloud that hovered in the sky over the ocean. It was of very unusual color, purple red, and the glow was so bright that there was pain in the eyes of the observers. Other witnesses who were at the time in the area of the Tserkovnaya Bay mentioned one more detail. Inside the red cloud, you could see a red stain or center, which was of the correctly spherical form, meaning that was perfectly spherical. Many of the eyewitnesses said that the cloud actually looked like a pillar of a bright red color, which would glow and then dim. Also, one border guard mentioned that the unusual object was flying along the island at the basically at 1 meter, at the height of 1 kilometer. The black cloud inside, the black center inside the red sphere, at the same time looked like it was separated into different parts by two silvery rays, which actually were reflected in the sea waters. When the object was flying near Shikotan, the screens of the radars registered very strong issues, and the weather was fine, so such problems with the radio were of the artificial character, nothing that could be created naturally. It was about 30 minutes before that this same unusual phenomenon was observed from aboard the Soviet ship with a very strange name, Agvekinot. And also people who worked in the harbor on Kunashir observed the same. In the area of the Laguna Lake, they saw a pillar of light which was directed towards the ground. And then they also saw the spot from where the light was coming from. In the center of that spot, you could see a very unusual stain. It glowed for a little bit more than a minute. So this took place at the same evening, two neighboring islands, a very unusual phenomena, described in similar terms. Still no one knows what it was, a UFO, a strange cloud because of the volcanic activity of the numerous volcanoes in the South Kurils. What's interesting is that those who researched the that case mention that similar objects have been sighted before, and not long before this case, people of the islands, of the two islands, saw a big cigar-shaped object in the sky over the islands. We go forward to 1990, and there was a very unusual case reported from the Iturup. There was an object that was seen, and the shape was a dark cloud, and it was right over the forest. It had interesting yellow stains or spots, which look like the portholes. But if you look at the altitude through binoculars, it actually looked that a flying saucer landed in the forest clearing. The first observer mentioned that there were two bright orange rays that changed colors to red, and then they changed position from the vertical into horizontal. Those who observed were sure it was a UFO. It was more than an hour that this very unusual phenomena was occurring. Later, thick fog, which is quite usual for the islands, thick fog came about, and the lights dimmed. So about a dozen of people talked about this case for a whole night, and they were sure that a UFO visited the island. Interesting that about an hour before, something similar was sighted in the Kurils city by the Lebedina lake, and then twice in the area of the volcanoes Baransky, Tebinkov. And in 1990 they wanted to find out the nature of this phenomenon, but they couldn't, because the Soviet Union was falling apart basically, and people did not have enough time to study UFOs. But some of the cases were quite sinister, and in the same area, in the same year, there was a very unusual case which was reported by a woman who lived in Kurils and told it to the news reporters. She mentioned that she felt that somebody was looking at her, and she felt a very bad feeling going from her head to her spine. She looked around, but there was nobody around, but she was very alarmed. And at night she had to wake up, and going back to the bedroom, she noticed a light outside her window, as if coming from the headlights. So she was curious. She opened the window, and basically she could not move after that, because forever, she says, she remembers what she had seen outside. It was a bright ray of light which was directed at the nearby structures, and the light was coming down, and she could see quite distinctly that the object was of the trapezoid or trapezium shape, and he had four legs underneath, also of the shape of the small trapezoids. Something from the side reminded her of a projector. That's where the light was coming from, and above it was a well-lit sphere. The object moved in the elliptoid-like direction, elliptical direction, and she heard a noise as if rustling of the leaves. She told a number of people about it, and she was doubted, including her husband. But she says that she would never wake anybody up to look at it because of the horror that she felt. It was like basic animal horror. She felt like she was paralyzed. like her conscience was turned off. Only fear, unexplainable fear, and no thoughts at the time. She says that she had lived a rough life. She had gone through a lot in her life. She was once threatened with murder, and she says that she was scared at the time because she didn't want her children to be with small children without her mother. But this was a different, completely different feeling. It wasn't even a feeling, but the state of mind. And she says she wouldn't wish it on her worst enemy to go through the same. When this condition left, when she was relieved from it and she could walk, she observed that the object started taking its second turn. So she went under a blanket with her head because she was full of fear, and she said it lasted for 4 more days. She was even afraid to come back to her apartment. She felt like somebody was watching her. And it took place on September 5th or 6th of 1990. Her neighbors said that what's interesting is their dog was making strange noises at night, also howled, and died the second day without any disease or anything like that. The neighbors in the area told her that there were howling of the dogs, unusual howlings, all over the area. Of course, it doesn't mean that it was extraterrestrial, but no one knows what it was. And she says that she has very bad memories from the event. She was trying to find out if anybody else experienced it, and also so did the reporter from the Krasny Mayak newspaper. The story was published in Kurils on September 29 of 1990. I've never heard anything else about this case since then. There were other cases on Kunashir reported from basically the same year of strange visits from extraterrestrials or other beings, and they were reported by school girls. A very unusual case and very unusual description of the beings that had been sighted in the apartment of these girls. But nothing else came from this story. To nothing. There were no subsequent investigation. I guess how could it be in a far away, remote land away from the Central Soviet Union, and the country was disintegrating. But the only interesting confirmation was that the military people in the same area saw an unidentified flying object, but it wasn't registered on their radars. This was reported in the Svobodny Sakhalin newspaper. Not that far from the area, but in the Japanese waters. In 1997, there was a case of an object that fell into the waters from the sky, and the divers who were just coming to the surface observed this strange object. It had a trail in the sky, and it actually hovered over the boat for about 20 minutes that serviced the divers. That's after 20 minutes it fell into the water, and this was reported, and the special troops, I should say, were sent to recover it, but they could not find anything else. The only thing that was discovered was an oily spot on the surface, which chemical composition was so strange that the experts said it could not remind them of anything that could be created on Earth, any fuel that would be used by terrestrial aviation. We don't know what happened to that case. We do know that in the Japanese Ministry of Safety, of Marine Safety, officially stated that this something could not be civilian or military airplanes, because at the time nothing like that was registered in the area. This case was reported in 1997 in Moscow, and I don't have any subsequent developments about this case. In 2004, there was another very interesting case that took place in the Kuril airfield, Burevestnik. We still don't know what happened over that airfield, but some of the people, military people who reported it, reminded the reporter that they seen something very unusual, and they said that at certain time in the evening, about 7 o'clock actually, they looked at the sky and they saw a gigantic object of white color. There was a purple ray coming from that object, and one of the soldiers told the other, his comrades, to look in the sky. They remembered that the phenomenon took about 6 to 7 seconds. After that, the object disappeared at incredible speed, and they couldn't register its movements. Another case and another report about similar observation described an object of the oval form of white color that could disappear instantly. The observer mentioned that, looking down from the control center, he mentioned that he could see several such objects, and they were flattened from the sides. They were of different colors, and he mentioned that they were red, yellow, and white. All of them disappeared, one after another. What's interesting is that the soldiers mentioned that they didn't feel right. They felt alarm after observing these objects. They told it all to the special desk, meaning that they told it to the KGB of the modern KGB officer who was on site, and he himself wanted to find out what it was, because such events or wonders, like he mentioned, are seen by military people all over the area and about the same time. So this was very interesting, because the journalist who reported it actually left his telephone number and his address, trying to find out more about this very unusual case. And I'm not sure if he did, because there were no subsequent publications, and I did not receive any information from the people that I'm in touch with. Now, what's interesting is that for centuries there have been reports about strange glow in the ocean in the area of the Kuril Islands, and I mentioned a number of cases in my book, Russia's USO Secrets. Philip Mantel and I collected a number of USO reports from the area, and it's very interesting because of the reports of the bright spots that appear underneath the ships or in the sky of the area that would move at incredible speeds and enhance its size in front of the eyes of the observers. Gigantic ovals that could be as long as a quarter of mile wide, and sometimes you could see gigantic pillar of light. Quite a lot and a number of interesting cases we mentioned. So I am urging people to keep looking at the Kuril Islands, at all available news information and news items, because I think there will be more stories coming from the areas of Iturubku, Nashir, Shikatan, Habomai, and other islands. The situation is not calm Russia is going to bring 3 more new divisions and to the area, at least one for sure, to the area of the Kuril Islands. Japan is not happy. Russia will deploy a range of coastal missile systems on the islands. They're rebuilding the infrastructure for their own national reasons, and we know that the peace treaty was never signed at the end of World War II, and hopefully there'll be a peaceful resolution to the issue. But meanwhile, the military presence is increasing, and as it does, I'm sure those who come to the islands will discover more UFO and USO cases, and maybe we will get a chance to find out more about what's going on in the Kuril Islands. I still have to describe more cases and interesting phenomena from Kamchatka, Sakhalin Islands, and other islands in the Kuril chain. Thank you.